Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country, but she never imagined it would lead her to this moment. Standing at the entrance of Fort Harrison Military Base, she clutched her newly issued credentials with trembling hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete barriers. An armed guard scrutinized every vehicle entering the facility. At 28, Sarah had spent the last 6 years working her way up through various government agencies. Her background in international relations and fluency in 4 languages had caught the attention of some very important people in Washington. What started as a desk job analyzing foreign communications had evolved into something much more significant, though she couldn't discuss the details with anyone, not even her family. The black sedan that had picked her up from her hotel that morning was unlike any government vehicle she had ever seen. The driver, a stern-faced man in a dark suit, had barely spoken during the 40-minute drive. He had simply handed her a manila envelope containing her temporary access credentials and a brief note instructing her to report to Building 7 immediately upon arrival. Sarah's heart raced as she approached the main security checkpoint. She had been through military bases before during her previous assignments, but Fort Harrison was different. This wasn't just any military installation. It was one of the most secure facilities in the country, home to some of the military's most classified operations. The guard at the checkpoint was a young corporal who looked barely older than her youngest brother. He examined her identification with the thoroughness of someone who took his job very seriously. Sarah noticed his nameplate read Thompson and tried to offer him a reassuring smile, but he remained focused on his duties. "Purpose of visit, ma'am?" Corporal Thompson asked, his voice professional but curious. It was clear that civilian visitors were not common at Fort Harrison, especially ones arriving alone in unmarked government vehicles. "I'm here for a briefing in Building 7, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She handed him the additional documentation from the manila envelope, though she wasn't entirely sure what it contained. Everything about this assignment had been handled on a need-to-know basis, and apparently, she only needed to know the bare minimum. Thompson examined the papers carefully, his brow furrowing slightly as he read. He looked up at Sarah, then back at the documents, then reached for his phone to make a call. Sarah could hear him speaking in low tones to someone on the other end, confirming her arrival and requesting guidance. While she waited, Sarah observed the bustling activity around the base. Military personnel moved with purpose between buildings, their uniforms crisp and their bearing unmistakably professional. Vehicles ranging from standard military trucks to sophisticated communications equipment passed through the checkpoint with routine efficiency. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, Thompson returned her documents and gestured toward a waiting golf cart. "Someone will escort you to Building 7, ma'am. Please follow Sergeant Williams." Sergeant Williams was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. As they drove through the base, she pointed out various landmarks and explained some of the facility's history. Sarah learned that Fort Harrison had been established during World War II and had played crucial roles in every major military operation since then. Building 7 is where they handle the really important stuff, Sergeant Williams explained as they approached a nondescript concrete structure that looked remarkably similar to every other building on the base. Most of us regular folks never get to see the inside of that place. Sarah thanked Sergeant Williams and approached the entrance to Building 7. Another security checkpoint awaited her, this one staffed by 2 Marines who looked like they could bench press a small car. The process was repeated, credentials examined, phone calls made, and eventually clearance granted. Inside Building 7, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the rest of the base. The corridors were quieter, the lighting more subdued, and the few people she encountered moved with an almost secretive purpose. Sarah was directed to a conference room on the 3rd floor, where she was told to wait for further instructions. The conference room was spartanly furnished with a large wooden table, several chairs, and a series of monitors mounted on the walls. Sarah took a seat and tried to calm her nerves by reviewing what little she knew about her assignment. She had been told only that her expertise in international communications and her security clearance had made her an ideal candidate for a special project requiring immediate attention. As she waited, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a military family, she had always felt a deep sense of duty to serve her country. Her father had been a career Army officer, and her older brother was currently deployed overseas. Service wasn't just a career choice for the Martinez family. It was a calling. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor interrupted her thoughts. Sarah straightened in her chair and prepared to meet whoever was about to walk through that door, knowing that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The door opened to reveal a tall man in his early 50s, wearing a perfectly pressed uniform adorned with more ribbons and medals than Sarah had ever seen on one person. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, and his steel gray eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room and its occupant in a single glance. The nameplate on his uniform read General Morrison, and even without knowing his specific rank, Sarah could tell this was someone very important. General Morrison entered the room with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. Behind him followed two other officers, a colonel with graying temples and a major who appeared to be about Sarah's age. They took their seats across from her at the conference table, and Sarah noticed how their body language immediately shifted to alert attention when the general sat down. "Miss Martinez," General Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in military leadership, "I understand you've been briefed on the sensitive nature of why you're here today." Sarah nodded, though the truth was that she had been briefed on very little. "Yes, sir, though I admit the details have been kept quite limited." The general leaned back in his chair and studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. There was something in his expression that made Sarah feel as though she were being evaluated for something far more significant than a typical government assignment. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. "Your background is impressive," he continued, opening a thick folder that one of the other officers had placed before him. 6 years in government service, top security clearance, multiple commendations for your work in international communications analysis. Your supervisors speak very highly of your discretion and professionalism." Sarah felt a flush of pride at the recognition, but she also sensed there was more to this conversation than a performance review. General Morrison's tone suggested he was building towards something important, and the presence of the other officers indicated this was a matter of significant military interest. "However," the general said, and Sarah's heart sank slightly at the word, "there are aspects of this assignment that go beyond your previous experience. This isn't just about analyzing communications or preparing reports for bureaucrats in Washington. This is about national security at the highest levels." The colonel leaning forward and cleared his throat. "Miss Martinez, what we're about to discuss cannot leave this room. The project we're proposing requires someone with your specific skill set, but it also requires someone who can operate under extreme pressure while maintaining absolute confidentiality." Sarah straightened in her chair. "I understand, sir. My record shows that I've handled classified information responsibly throughout my career." General Morrison nodded but continued to study her with that intense gaze. "This is different, Miss Martinez. This assignment would require you to work directly with foreign diplomatic personnel, some of whom may not be entirely trustworthy. You would be representing the interests of the United States government in situations where the wrong word or gesture could have international consequences." The major, who had remained silent until now, pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a series of documents. "The assignment would last approximately 6 months, he explained. You would be based here at Fort Harrison for training and preparation, then deployed to various locations as needed. Your cover story would be that you're a civilian contractor, working on routine diplomatic communications." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was clearly far beyond anything she had done before, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge she had been hoping for. After years of desk work and routine analysis, the opportunity to serve her country in a more direct and meaningful way was incredibly appealing. "What exactly would my role be?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing excitement. General Morrison exchanged glances with the other officers before responding. "You would be serving as a liaison between our military intelligence operations and certain foreign government officials. Your job would be to facilitate communications, gather information, and report back on the attitudes and intentions of these individuals." The colonel added, "You would be operating under special diplomatic immunity, which means you would carry credentials that identify you as an official representative of the United States government. These credentials would grant you access to facilities and individuals that are normally Off-limits to civilian personnel. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what they were describing. This sounded like intelligence work, possibly even espionage, though they were carefully avoiding using those terms. The responsibility was enormous, and the potential consequences of failure were clearly significant. "I'm honored that you would consider me for such an assignment," Sarah said carefully. "But I have to ask, why me? Surely there are others with more experience in this type of work." General Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the room, though it was a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your background makes you perfect for this assignment, Miss Martinez. You're young enough to be underestimated by those who might otherwise be suspicious, but experienced enough to handle complex situations. More importantly, you have no prior history in intelligence work, which means you're not known to foreign intelligence services." The major looked up from his tablet. "Your language skills and cultural knowledge would also be invaluable. Many of the individuals you would be working with speak English as a second language, and your ability to communicate with them in their native tongues could provide significant advantages." Sarah realized that everything in her career had been leading to this moment. All the late nights studying foreign languages, all the tedious hours analyzing communications traffic, all the security clearances and background investigations had been preparing her for this opportunity. It was exactly what she had dreamed of when she first entered government service. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the same conference room where her life had changed forever. The intensive training period had been unlike anything she could have imagined. 16-hour days filled with language immersion, cultural sensitivity briefings, diplomatic protocol instruction, and what the trainers euphemistically called situational awareness exercises that felt suspiciously like spy training. Her trainers had been an eclectic mix of retired diplomats, former intelligence officers, and active-duty military personnel who seemed to know far more about international relations than their uniforms might suggest. They had taught her everything from proper etiquette at state dinners to how to spot surveillance and escape potentially dangerous situations. The most challenging part of the training had been learning to maintain her cover story while staying true to her actual mission. Sarah had practiced countless scenarios where she might be questioned about her presence at various diplomatic functions or military installations. The key, her instructors emphasized, was to stick as close to the truth as possible while revealing nothing of substance about her real purpose. Now, as she waited for her final briefing before deployment, Sarah reviewed the credentials that had been prepared for her. The identification card looked official enough, with her photograph and basic information clearly displayed. What made it special was the small emblem at the bottom corner, a symbol she had been told represented her status as a special diplomatic liaison. General Morrison entered the room punctually at 8 o'clock, accompanied by the same colonel and major from their first meeting. This time, however, there was an additional person with them, a woman in civilian clothes who was introduced as Director Patricia Hayes from an agency whose name Sarah didn't recognize, but whose initials suggested connections to the intelligence community. "Miss Martinez," General Morrison began, "your training scores have been exceptional. Your instructors tell me you've mastered the protocols and procedures faster than anyone they've previously worked with." Sarah felt a surge of pride but remained focused on what she knew would be the important part of this meeting, her actual assignment details. For 3 weeks she had been preparing for a mission that remained frustratingly vague in its specifics. Director Hayes opened a briefcase and pulled out a manila folder marked with classification stamps that Sarah had never seen before. "Your first assignment will be relatively straightforward," she explained. "There's a series of diplomatic receptions being held at various military installations across the country over the next month. Foreign military attachés and diplomatic personnel will be attending these events." The colonel pointed to a series of photographs that Director Hayes had spread across the table. "Your job is to attend these receptions, engage with specific individuals we've identified, and report back on their attitudes toward current American foreign policy initiatives." Sarah studied the photographs, noting that they appeared to be surveillance shots taken at various official functions. The faces were diverse, representing what appeared to be officials from at least a dozen different countries. Some looked friendly and approachable, while others had the guarded expressions of career diplomats who were used to being watched and evaluated. "How do I approach these individuals without seeming obvious?" Sarah asked. Won't they be suspicious of a young woman who suddenly appears at multiple military functions? General Morrison smiled approvingly at the question. That's exactly the right concern to have, he said. Your cover story is that you're a civilian consultant working on a communications infrastructure project for the Defense Department. This explains your presence at military facilities and gives you a legitimate reason to be interested in international cooperation and communication protocols. Director Hayes added, several of these individuals have already been told to expect you. They think you're gathering information about communication preferences and procedures for future diplomatic exchanges. They'll actually be eager to talk to you because they'll see it as an opportunity to influence American policy in their favor. The Major pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a detailed schedule. Your first event is tomorrow night at Fort Richardson. It's a reception honoring the visiting Bulgarian military delegation. You'll be introduced as a consultant working on improving communication protocols between allied nations. Sarah studied the schedule and noted that she would be attending functions at military bases across the country over the next 4 weeks. Each event seemed to focus on different foreign delegations, and she realized that by the end of the month, she would have interacted with representatives from nearly every major nation that had significant military cooperation agreements with the United States. What specific information am I looking for? She asked, wanting to ensure she understood her objectives clearly. Director Hayes leaned forward and lowered her voice slightly, even though they were in a secure facility. We're particularly interested in their views on the new defense cooperation agreements being negotiated. Some of our allies are expressing concerns about certain provisions, and we need to understand whether these concerns are genuine policy disagreements or if they're being influenced by pressure from other nations. The colonel added, we're also interested in their personal opinions about American military leadership. There have been some concerning reports that certain foreign officials believe our current military commanders are inexperienced or unreliable. We need to know if these perceptions are widespread and what's driving them. General Morrison stood and walked to one of the monitors on the wall, which displayed a world map with various countries highlighted in different colors. The international security environment is becoming increasingly complex, he explained. Traditional alliances are being tested and new threats are emerging from unexpected directions. Your work will help us understand how our allies and partners really view our capabilities and commitments. Sarah realized that her assignment was far more significant than she had initially understood. She wouldn't just be gathering routine diplomatic intelligence. She would be helping to assess the strength and reliability of America's international relationships at a time when those relationships might be crucial to national security. The weight of the responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. In just 24 hours, she would be walking into her first assignment, carrying credentials that she hoped would open doors and provide access to information that could influence American foreign policy. Everything she had learned and trained for was about to be put to the test in the real world. Fort Richardson buzzed with activity as staff members made final preparations for the evening's reception. Sarah arrived 2 hours early as instructed, to familiarize herself with the layout and review her approach strategies one final time. The base was smaller than Fort Harrison but equally impressive, with well-maintained buildings and grounds that spoke to the pride the military took in its installations. She had spent the morning reviewing files on the Bulgarian delegation, memorizing names, faces, and brief biographical information about each member. The delegation was led by General Petrov Dimitrov, a career military officer who had served in various NATO operations and was considered a strong supporter of Bulgarian-American cooperation. His deputy, Colonel Elena Marinova, was newer to international assignments but had impressed American officials during recent joint training exercises. Sarah's dress for the evening was carefully chosen to strike the right balance between professional competence and approachable friendliness. Her dark blue suit was conservative enough for a military function, but tailored well enough to suggest success and confidence. The special identification badge she wore was deliberately prominent, designed to invite questions and provide conversation starters. As guests began arriving for the reception, Sarah positioned herself near the registration table where she could observe the arrivals and identify her targets for the evening. The Bulgarian delegation arrived precisely on time, and she was struck by how different they looked from their official photographs. General Dimitrov was shorter than she had expected, but carried himself with unmistakable authority. Colonel Marinova was younger and appeared more comfortable in social settings than her stern official portrait had suggested. Sarah waited until the delegation had completed their initial greetings with their American hosts before approaching. She had learned during training that timing was crucial in these situations. Approaching too early could seem pushy, while waiting too long might mean missing opportunities as people became engaged in other conversations. "General Dimitrov," she said, extending her hand with a confident smile. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm working on a communications infrastructure project for the Defense Department, and I was hoping I might have a chance to speak with you this evening about Bulgaria's experiences with international military communications." The general shook her hand firmly and studied her identification badge with interest. "Miss Martinez," he said in accented but clear English, "it is a pleasure to meet you. Communications infrastructure is indeed very important for modern military cooperation." Colonel Marinova joined the conversation, and Sarah was pleased to discover that both officers were genuinely interested in discussing their experiences with joint communications during NATO exercises. As the conversation progressed, Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the interaction while carefully steering the discussion toward the topics that interested her. "Handlers. We have found American military communications to be generally very reliable," General Dimitrov explained, "but there are sometimes challenges with protocol compatibility and security clearance procedures." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "Those are exactly the kinds of issues our project is designed to address. Are there specific areas where you feel improvements could be made?" Colonel Marinova glanced around the room before responding, and Sarah noticed the subtle caution that entered her demeanor. "There are always improvements possible," she said diplomatically, "but we must be careful about discussing such matters in social settings." The general, however, seemed less concerned about discretion. "The biggest challenge," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "is that we sometimes feel American military leadership does not fully understand the political pressures we face in our region. What seems simple to commanders in Washington can be very complicated for those of us dealing with local realities." This was exactly the kind of information Sarah had been sent to gather, and she felt a thrill of accomplishment at having elicited it so naturally. She carefully guided the conversation to explore what specific political pressures the general was referring to, while maintaining the pretense that she was simply trying to understand communication challenges. Over the next hour, Sarah moved through the reception, engaging with various members of the Bulgarian delegation and other foreign military personnel who were present. Each conversation provided pieces of a larger puzzle about how America's allies viewed current military leadership and policy directions. She learned that several Eastern European nations were concerned about American commitment to regional security, particularly given recent changes in military leadership and defense spending priorities. There was also underlying tension about new weapon systems and technology sharing agreements that some allies felt favored certain nations over others. The most revealing conversation came near the end of the evening when she found herself speaking with a Romanian colonel who had apparently had several drinks and was more candid than diplomatic protocol would normally allow. He expressed frustration with what he called arrogant American generals who made decisions about regional security without consulting with local commanders who understood the complexities on the ground. "They come to our exercises with their fancy uniforms and their medals," the Romanian officer said, gesturing broadly, "but they do not understand that politics and military strategy cannot be separated in our part of the world." Sarah listened carefully, asking follow-up questions that encouraged him to elaborate, while being careful not to appear too interested or to push too hard for specific information. The skill of drawing out information without seeming to interrogate was one of the most valuable techniques she had learned during training. As the reception wound down, Sarah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Her first assignment had been more successful than she had dared to hope, and she had gathered substantial information about Allied perceptions of American military leadership and policy. The conversations had flowed naturally, and none of the foreign officers had seemed suspicious of her presence or her questions. Walking back to her car in the parking lot, Sarah reflected on how different the reality of intelligence gathering was from the dramatic portrayals she had seen in movies and television shows. There had been no secret codes, no dangerous confrontations, no elaborate disguises. Instead, it had been a matter of skilled conversation, careful listening, and the ability to ask the right questions at the right moments. She was eager to return to Fort Harrison and brief her handlers on what she had learned, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. Over the next month, she would be attending similar functions at bases across the country, and each one would present new challenges and opportunities to gather information that could influence American foreign policy and military strategy. 2 weeks and 5 military installations later, Sarah had settled into a rhythm that felt almost routine. Each reception followed a similar pattern: arrive early, review target profiles, engage in carefully orchestrated conversations, and depart with valuable intelligence about Allied perceptions of American military policies. Her confidence had grown with each successful assignment, and her handlers at Fort Harrison had expressed satisfaction with the quality of information she was gathering. Fort Braxton was her 6th assignment, and the reception was honoring a joint delegation from Germany and the Netherlands. Sarah had studied the attendee list carefully and identified several high-priority targets, including General Klaus Weber, a veteran German officer who had been openly critical of recent American military decisions in European theater operations. The reception was being held in the base's officer club, an elegant facility that had been recently renovated to accommodate high-level diplomatic functions. Sarah arrived to find that the event was larger and more formal than the previous reception she had attended, with nearly 200 guests including senior American military leadership from the region. She had been mingling for about an hour, successfully engaging with several Dutch officers and gathering useful information about their concerns regarding NATO burden-sharing agreements, when she noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A group of senior American officers had gathered around someone who had apparently just arrived, and their body language suggested a mix of surprise and irritation. Curious about what was causing the disturbance, Sarah moved closer and realized that the center of attention was a general she didn't recognize from her briefing materials. He was a large man with graying hair and a stern expression, wearing a uniform that displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations. The nameplate on his uniform read General Patterson, and even from a distance, Sarah could tell he was not pleased about something. "Excuse me," she heard General Patterson say in a voice that carried across the room, "but I was not aware that civilian contractors were being granted access to classified military functions." Sarah's heart sank as she realized he was looking directly at her. Several other officers turned to follow his gaze, and she suddenly found herself the center of unwanted attention. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected challenge to her presence. "General Patterson," one of the American hosts interjected, "Miss Martinez is here as part of an authorized Defense Department communications project. Her credentials have been verified and approved." General Patterson strode across the room toward Sarah, his expression growing more skeptical with each step. "Communications project?" he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "What kind of communications project requires a civilian to attend classified diplomatic receptions?" Sarah felt the eyes of dozens of people on her as General Patterson approached. Her training had prepared her for questions about her presence, but not for such a public challenge from a senior military officer. She took a deep breath and decided to stick to her cover story while remaining calm and professional. "General Patterson," she said, extending her hand and maintaining eye contact, "I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm working on improving communication protocols between Allied military forces. My project requires me to understand how different nations prefer to handle diplomatic and military communications." General Patterson ignored her outstretched hand and instead focused on the identification badge hanging from her lapel. "That's quite a fancy badge for a civilian contractor," he said with obvious skepticism. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Sarah felt a wave of panic but tried not to let it show. The badge had been specially prepared for her assignment, and she had been assured that it would withstand scrutiny from military personnel. However, she hadn't anticipated having it examined by a general who was clearly suspicious of her presence. "Of course, sir," she replied, unclipping the badge and handing it to him. "I understand your concern about security at these functions." General Patterson examined the badge carefully, turning it over in his hands and studying every detail. Sarah noticed that several foreign officers, including her German and Dutch targets, had moved closer to observe the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of attention she had been trained to avoid. "This is quite impressive," General Patterson said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Very official-looking. Almost like something a real government official might carry." He handed the badge back to Sarah with a dismissive gesture. "Tell me, Miss Martinez, what exactly qualifies a young civilian like yourself to advise the military on communications protocols?" Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. This general was obviously trying to humiliate her in front of the foreign delegates, and she couldn't let him succeed. Her mission was too important, and too many people were depending on the information she was gathering. "I have a master's degree in international relations and 6 years of experience analyzing military communications for various government agencies," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My background includes extensive work with NATO communication protocols and diplomatic messaging systems." General Patterson laughed, a sound that carried no warmth or humor. "6 years of experience," he repeated mockingly. "I've been serving this country for 32 years, young lady, and I can spot a phony from across the room. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't appreciate civilians with fake credentials infiltrating military functions." The word fake hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah felt the situation spiraling out of control. She could see foreign officers whispering among themselves, and she knew that this confrontation was undermining not just her mission, but potentially American credibility with important allies. "Sir," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of steel, "I can assure you that my credentials are absolutely genuine. If you have concerns about my authorization to be here, I suggest you contact the appropriate authorities rather than making accusations in front of our international guests." General Patterson's face reddened, and Sarah realized she had just made the situation significantly worse by challenging him in public. The room had grown noticeably quieter, and she could feel the tension building toward what might become a major diplomatic incident. The confrontation had reached a critical point, with nearly everyone in the reception hall now aware of the heated exchange between General Patterson and Sarah. Foreign delegates stood in small groups, whispering among themselves and casting glances toward the unfolding drama. Sarah could see her carefully planned mission falling apart in real time, and she knew she had to find a way to salvage the situation. General Patterson stepped closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was still audible to those nearby. "Young lady, I've seen plenty of people try to talk their way into places they don't belong. Your little badge might fool some people, but it doesn't fool me. I'm going to have security escort you out of here, and then we're going to have a very serious conversation about who you really are and what you're doing here." Sarah felt cornered and desperate. Her training had covered many scenarios, but not this one. She had been told that her credentials would be accepted without question by military personnel, and she had never anticipated being publicly challenged by a general who seemed determined to expose her as a fraud. The room had grown so quiet that she could hear the slight hum of the air conditioning system. German General Klaus Weber, whom she had been hoping to engage in conversation later in the evening, stood just a few feet away, watching the confrontation with obvious interest. Colonel Marinova from the Bulgarian delegation was also present, having arrived as part of a follow-up diplomatic visit, and Sarah could see the confusion and concern in her eyes. "General Patterson," Sarah said, her voice now carrying a note of desperation that she hoped wasn't too obvious. "I understand your concerns about security, but I can assure you that my presence here has been authorized at the highest levels. If you'll allow me to make a phone call, I can have someone confirm my credentials immediately." General Patterson shook his head dismissively. "I'm not interested in your phone calls or your explanations. What I'm interested in is how a supposed civilian contractor managed to get a fake government badge and talk her way into a classified military function." He gestured toward the identification badge that Sarah had clipped back to her lapel. "That badge might look official, but I've been in the military long enough to recognize a counterfeit when I see one." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of some way to prove her legitimacy without revealing the true nature of her assignment. The irony wasn't lost on her that her real credentials were so classified that she couldn't use them to defend herself against accusations of carrying fake ones. Then, in a moment of inspiration born from desperation, Sarah remembered something her trainers had told her about the special emblem on her identification badge. They had mentioned that it was a legitimate government symbol, that would be recognized by senior military and intelligence personnel, but they had warned her to only point it out if absolutely necessary. "General Patterson," she said, her voice gaining strength as she unclipped her badge again. "Before you have me escorted out, would you mind taking another look at this badge? Specifically, I'd like you to examine the emblem in the lower right corner." General Patterson took the badge with obvious reluctance, clearly expecting to find more evidence of forgery. Sarah watched his face carefully as his eyes focused on the small emblem that she had been told represented her status as a presidential liaison. For a moment his expression remained skeptical, but then she saw something change. His eyes widened slightly and he looked up at Sarah with a completely different expression. The arrogance and dismissiveness were gone, replaced by what appeared to be shock and growing concern. He looked back down at the badge, studying the emblem more carefully, then looked at Sarah again as if seeing her for the first time. "Where did you get this badge?" he asked, his voice now quiet and serious rather than confrontational. "It was issued to me by the appropriate authorities for my current assignment," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact and trying to project confidence despite her racing heart. General Patterson continued to stare at the emblem, and Sarah could see him processing the implications of what he was seeing. The change in his demeanor was so dramatic that several nearby officers had noticed and were moving closer to see what had caused such a transformation. "Do you understand what this emblem represents?" General Patterson asked, his voice now carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there moments before. "Yes, sir, I do," Sarah replied, though she realized she only had a general understanding of its significance. Her trainers had told her it indicated special presidential authorization, but they hadn't provided details about what that meant in practical terms. General Patterson handed the badge back to Sarah with considerably more care than he had shown before. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice now formal and respectful, "I owe you an apology. I was not aware of the nature of your authorization." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting." Sarah clipped her badge back to her lapel, noting that the foreign delegates who had been watching the confrontation now appeared even more interested in what was happening. General Weber was studying her with new attention, and she realized that the dramatic confrontation might have actually enhanced her credibility rather than destroying it. "That won't be necessary. General Patterson," she said graciously, "I understand your concern for security at these functions. It's exactly the kind of vigilance that makes our military strong." The general nodded, but Sarah could see that he was still processing the implications of what had just happened. She realized that whatever that emblem represented, it carried far more weight than she had understood when it was issued to her. The remainder of the reception proceeded with a completely different atmosphere than Sarah could have imagined an hour earlier. Word of the confrontation and its surprising resolution had spread quickly through the gathering, and she found herself the subject of curious and respectful attention from both American and foreign military personnel. General Patterson had quietly withdrawn from the main reception area, but not before approaching several senior officers and engaging in hushed conversations that involved frequent glances in Sarah's direction. She could only imagine what he was telling them about the emblem on her badge and what it might mean for her status within the military hierarchy. The foreign delegates who had witnessed the confrontation were now approaching her with a level of deference that surprised and somewhat unsettled her. General Weber, who had been on her priority contact list, sought her out within minutes of General Patterson's departure and introduced himself with obvious respect. "Miss Martinez," he said in accented but precise English, "I must say that was quite an impressive display of composure under pressure. General Patterson is known for his directness in dealing with people he perceives as outsiders." Sarah smiled diplomatically, still processing the rapid change in her circumstances. "General Weber, I'm pleased to meet you. I was hoping we might have an opportunity to discuss some of the communication challenges that arise during joint NATO operations." The German general's demeanor was noticeably different from the other military personnel she had engaged with during previous assignments, where others had been polite but somewhat condescending toward a young civilian contractor. General Weber spoke to her as though she were a peer, or perhaps even a superior. "I would be honored to discuss such matters with you," he replied. "Perhaps we could arrange a more detailed conversation at a later time. I suspect your insights into these issues would be quite valuable." Similar interactions followed with other foreign delegates throughout the evening. The Dutch officers who had seemed mildly interested in her communications project earlier now treated her with obvious respect and eagerness to please. Even Colonel Marinova, whom Sarah remembered from her successful first assignment, approached her with what seemed like genuine deference. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Marinova said when she had a chance to speak privately, "I must confess that I am curious about the nature of your work. The emblem on your identification suggests a level of authority that goes beyond typical contractor relationships." Sarah realized that the confrontation with General Patterson had inadvertently revealed something about her status that made her far more interesting to these foreign officers than her cover story alone could have accomplished. The challenge now was figuring out how to use this enhanced credibility without revealing anything about her actual mission. "I'm afraid I can't discuss many details about my authorization," she said carefully, "but I can tell you that improving communication between Allied military forces is considered a very high priority by senior leadership in Washington." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself gathering far more detailed and candid information than she had obtained during any of her previous assignments. The foreign officers seemed eager to share their concerns and opinions with someone they now perceived as having direct access to high-level American decision-makers. General Weber provided extensive details about German concerns regarding American military strategy in Eastern Europe, including specific criticisms of recent troop deployments and equipment allocations. The Dutch delegation shared their frustrations with what they saw as inconsistent American policies regarding technology sharing and joint training exercises. Most significantly, several officers from different delegations made similar comments about their perception that American military leadership had become isolated from the realities facing Allied nations. They expressed hope that someone with Sarah's apparent access to senior officials might be able to convey their concerns more effectively than traditional diplomatic channels. By the end of the evening, Sarah had gathered more intelligence about Allied perceptions and concerns than she had during all her previous assignments combined. The confrontation that had initially seemed like a disaster had actually enhanced her effectiveness as an intelligence gatherer in ways that no amount of training could have achieved. As she prepared to leave Fort Braxton, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her assignment had taken. The emblem on her badge clearly carried significance that went far beyond what she had been told during her briefings. The reaction of General Patterson and the subsequent behavior of the foreign delegates suggested that her authorization came from a level of government that commanded immediate respect and attention. During the drive back to her hotel, Sarah found herself wondering about the true scope of her assignment and the real reasons she had been selected for this work. The rapid transformation in how she was perceived after the emblem was noticed suggested that there were aspects of her mission that hadn't been fully explained to her. She was eager to return to Fort Harrison and brief her handlers about the evening's events, but she was also apprehensive about what their reaction might be. The confrontation with General Patterson had exposed her special status in a very public way, which might compromise her ability to operate under her civilian contractor cover story in the future. As she pulled into the hotel parking lot, Sarah realized that her career in intelligence work had taken a dramatic turn. Whether that turn would prove beneficial or problematic remained to be seen, but there was no question that everything had changed. The young woman who had entered government service with dreams of serving her country had discovered that she was already serving at a level far beyond anything she had imagined possible. The presidential emblem on her badge had opened doors she didn't even know existed, and now she would have to learn how to walk through them while maintaining the secrecy and professionalism that her position demanded. Her real education in the world of international intelligence and diplomacy was just beginning.